It's March 2026 and I'm in the Veneto, the northern Italian region that's home to Venezia and Verona. Sticking to that theme, I'm in Vicenza. "37 miles to the northwest of Venice and 28 miles northeast of Verona, Vicenza sits almost at the centre of Veneto, the modern-day Italian region that still retains references to the once great Republic of Venice. The first settlements in the location of modern-day Vicenza were likely on the small group of hills emerging from the marshy plain at the confluence point of several local rivers, sometime in the 6th century BCE. The local population were from the Veneti tribes who inhabited this part of what would be today northeastern Italy. Little is known about the events or politics of the city in pre-Roman times, as the settlement has continued to be inhabited for over 2,000 years, with each era building upon the earlier settlements, repeatedly reusing spaces and materials. With the arrival of the Romans on the Venetian plains, the Veneti became their loyal allies, fighting alongside them against other local tribes who they defeated in 222 BCE at the Battle of Clastidium. They were eventually rewarded with Latin rights in 89 BCE, followed by full Roman citizenship. During the Roman era, the city had basic walls constructed and then demolished and rebuilt on occasions as the urban expansion of the settlement took place. As the Roman Empire entered its death spiral in the 4th and 5th centuries, the city's walls were rebuilt again and its defences strengthened, though there's no documented evidence that the city was sacked or destroyed during the period when the Visigoths and Huns rampaged across the disintegrating empire. With the collapse of Rome, Vicenza appears to have emerged as a religious centre for the native population, though that didn't prevent it from suffering from depopulation caused by the Gothic War from 535 to 553. Whilst the Byzantines emerged victorious from the war, the city didn't remain under their control for long, as just 15 years later the Lombards migrated into Italy, conquering several cities, including Vicenza, which became a ducal seat. Charlemagne arrived in 774, with the city becoming incorporated into the Frankish kingdom, turning the Lombard duchy into a Frankish county, but retaining the political and cultural importance that it had gained whilst under the rule of the Lombards. Vicenza and its surrounding territories were incorporated into the March of Verona in 952, which was in effect an extension of the Duke of Bavaria, who remained in control of the city through the 11th century, which covered the period of the construction of the city's medieval walls, of which small parts still stand to today. By the latter half of the 12th century, the political influence of urban social groups across the Veneto began to grow, with the establishment of communes, first in Verona and Padua, before reaching Vicenza in 1147. The Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, sought to strengthen imperial authority over the communes with increased taxes and reasserting of royal prerogatives, though the effect was to cause the communes to set aside their individual interests and conflicts and to form into the Veronese League in 1164 to confront the emperor militarily. 3 years later, the Veronese League merged into the broader Lombard League. Following the League's victory at the Battle of Legnano, the Peace of Constance in 1183 granted the cities the right to collect their own taxes, administer their own justice, elect their own magistrates, and maintain or construct their own fortifications. Over the following 220 years or so, politicking families held sway over the cities of Veneto, sparking countless wars, overthrows and changes in leadership that eventually led to Vicenza becoming subordinate to Padua until the city sent envoys to the previously maritime-focused Republic of Venice, pledging devotion to them in 1404. With Verona following a similar route only a year later, the Venetians came to both cities' aids and went to war against Padua, with a victory leaving the Republic of Venice suddenly a land as well as a maritime power with control of the whole of the Veneto. For the next 400 years, the Venetians held sway over this corner of Europe, marked across the city by an impressive number of Lions of St. Mark, the calling card of the Venetian Republic. The gaining of a substantial foothold on the mainland probably helped the Republic of Venice survive longer than it would otherwise have done, as it slowly retreated west across the Mediterranean as the Ottomans seized first Cyprus, Crete, the Peloponnese, and then slowly retreating back up the Dalmatian coast. Starting in the 16th century, the city of Vicenza, which had been overshadowed by its fellow Venetian cities for a long time, began to flourish, in part through the works of Andrea Palladio, possibly one of the greatest and certainly one of the most influential architects to have ever lived. The Palladian style of architecture, pioneered by Andrea, spread first across the Republic, then Europe, before being embraced across the globe in the centuries that followed. Horse Guards in Whitehall, London, the former Parliament House in Dublin, and the White House in Washington, D.C. being just a small sample of famous buildings influenced or almost totally Palladian in their construction. Aware that the Republic was weak and determined to remain neutral in the brewing conflict between Napoleon and the Habsburg Empire, the Venetians permitted troop movements across the mainland, and from early 1797 the French army started to occupy one centre after another. On the 27th of April 1797, 300 French soldiers entered Vicenza after the Venetian captain fled the city under the cover of night without a fight. 15 days later, the Republic of Venice fell, and the cities of the mainland established their own municipalities. To maintain order, on the 16th of June, Napoleon issued a decree creating 7 central governments in the former Venetian mainland, of which Vicenza was one. Unstable governments which took unpopular decisions such as requisitions, forced loans, and an attempt to conscript young people for Napoleon's German campaign turned the situation critical, with the region at risk of descent into all-out conflict when, on the 17th of October, Napoleon ceded the Veneto to the Austrians in the Treaty of Camp Formio. On the 19th of January 1798, the armies of the Habsburg Empire entered Vicenza, greeted by cheering crowds. In the ensuing wars that Napoleon inflicted on Europe over the following decade and a half, the city changed hands between the French and Austrians on a number of occasions, with, for a brief period, Vicenza being annexed into the Kingdom of Italy, albeit a vassal state of the French Empire. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 that finally settled the borders of Europe in the wake of Napoleon's defeat placed Vicenza in the new state of the Kingdom of Lombardy Venetia, an integral part of the Austrian Empire. In 1848, a wave of revolutions erupted across Europe with, from March of that year, uprisings in Lombardy Venetia focused on Milan and Venice. On the 23rd of March, the Kingdom of Sardinia attacked the Habsburg army, which retreated, with Vicenza being liberated the following day. However, the Austrians countered, and on the 10th of June their army attacked Vicenza with 30,000 soldiers and 50 cannons. Vicenza could only muster 11,000 defenders and 2 cannons. The Austrians positioned their cannons on Monte Berrico, which overlooks the city centre, and threatened to bombard the now indefensible city. The following day, the Austrians were back in charge of Vicenza. The Third Italian War of Independence of 1866 appeared to be passing almost unnoticed by Vicenza, despite the city's proximity to the military operations. But on the night of 12th to 13th of July, the Austrian troops just upped sticks and abandoned the city, with troops from Italy wandering into the undefended city on the morning of the 13th. A plebiscite conducted on the 21st and 22nd of October formalised the Veneto's annexation into the Kingdom of Italy. Later that month, King Victor Emmanuel II visited Vicenza to reward the Gold Medal of Military Valour. During the First World War, Vicenza found itself inside the war zone as soon as Italy entered the war on the 23rd of May 1915 and suffered a number of air raids over the following years. In the years between the First and Second World War, Vicenza became one of the centres of Mussolini's fascist movement. As the southern parts of Italy moved out of control of the fascists and realigned to side of the Allies, the northern strongholds of Mussolini's movement came under the control of the Germans, with Nazis occupying central northern Italy at the beginning of September 1943, much to local dismay. A large resistance movement was formed in Vicenza, but suffered several massacres of its members by the combined Nazi and fascist forces. Consequently, the city suffered badly during the Second World War, coming under bombardments from Anglo-American forces on 12 occasions between Christmas Day 1943 and the 28th of April 1945. The repression that the Nazis and fascists had meted out on the population was reversed in the dying days of the war, as a general insurrection saw the province of Vicenza record the highest number of fascists killed, mostly in the days immediately after liberation. After the war, the city was once again awarded a gold medal, this time for resistance. At the same time, the city set about its reconstruction to restore it to its pre-war appearance. During the 1950s, the strong economic and industrial development that took place in Vicenza made it one of Italy's wealthiest cities. In 1994, the city was recognised by UNESCO with inclusion on the World Heritage List as Vicenza, the city of Palladio. 2 years later, the listing was expanded to include several villas in the region, so the inscription is now the city of Vicenza and the Palladian villas of Veneto. As each successive generation has built, expanded, rebuilt and reinterpreted the city, so much of the historic fabric of Vicenza has been lost, with just occasional glimpses of its pre-Renaissance occupation still being visible, and not all of them at street level. One of the largest remnants of the city's Roman past can be found in the Criptoportico Romano, the former subterranean passageways and food pantry of a Roman domus. The original Roman dwelling, no longer visible, have been replaced by the rectory of the cathedral and other surrounding buildings. Today, accessed on guided tours, you can descend down below the Piazza del Duomo and enter into the best preserved example of a Roman cryptoporticus for private dwelling north of the Po. The three corridors are arranged in a U-shape located around 6.3 metres below the current piazza above. The central branch is the longest at 29.5 metres long and 3.28 metres wide. The passageways are lit by 31 small windows open to the street above, though supplemented by electric lighting for health and safety in the modern era. Abandoned sometime in the 4th century, the site was only rediscovered during construction works taking place on the rectory of the cathedral in the summer of 1954. Cleaning, restoration and safety works took 3 years, but in 1957, after the laying of a modern tiled floor, the cryptoporticus was opened to the public. Back up above ground and just around the Piazza del Duomo, you reach the Bishop's Palace, which is today home to the Museo Diocesano di Vicenza, or the Diocesan Museum of the city, housing the collections of the cathedral and the bishops. The Bishop's Palace traces its history back to the original building on this site sometime in the 12th century, though the current building is a result of alterations in the 19th century and repairs following the Second World War. The museum was the idea of the then Bishop of Vicenza, Pietro Giacomo Nonis, with many of the artefacts held in the museum coming from his private collection that he built during travels earlier in his career, along with religious art and artefacts from the holdings of the diocese itself. Bishop Nonis retired from his position in 2003, with the museum itself opening to the public 2 years later, with Nonis and his successor performing the opening duties. The upper floors of the museum house the main ethnographic collection of Bishop Nonis, along with general artworks from the cathedral collections as well as religious artefacts. The ground floor houses some of the more monumental artefacts in the collection, including fragments of sarcophaguses from the 4th and 5th century and a Roman-era basin that was used as a public fountain in the Lombard period and then reused, until the early 19th century, as the baptismal font of the cathedral. Down in the basement are more archaeological artefacts, along with remains of a medieval tower. Opposite the Bishop's Palace is, naturally, the cathedral, or to give it its full name, the Cattedrale di Santa Maria Annunciata. Rebuilt several times over the centuries, the site the cathedral sits upon was originally a Roman building in the 1st century, in which a space for Christian worship was created in the 3rd century. The following century, the first purpose-built church was built on the site, which was replaced around 250 years later with a larger church, possibly as a result of the sacking of Vicenza by Huns, which may have left the earlier church damaged beyond repair, though there is no documented evidence. The first bishop of Vicenza, Orinizio, had the church replaced with a new larger building sometime around 600. This church survived with alterations and additions through to a devastating earthquake in 1117, centred close to Verona and still the strongest seismic event to have ever been recorded in the Po Valley, which caused damage across the Veneto region. The post-earthquake built church formed the basis of the current cathedral, though it underwent further repairs after Frederick II sacked the city in 1236, and major remodelling in the mid-15th century to create the Gothic facade, accompanied by general repairs. In the 1530s, Andrea Palladio completed the last major additions to the building, with the north portal and the tambour and dome at the eastern end of the cathedral. During the Second World War, the cathedral suffered several direct hits from Anglo-American bombings, with the dome and a large part of the nave destroyed and serious damage caused to the southern chapels and the facade. Whilst reconstruction work started almost as soon as peace was declared in 1945, the works weren't completed until 2002. One of the final acts of Bishop Nonnis was to rededicate the restored cathedral. Following his death in 2014, the bishop was the last to be buried in the crypt of the cathedral. Along with the cathedral and the church of San Lorenzo, one of the most important and largest of religious buildings in the city is the church of Santa Corona. Yeah, unfortunate name of the 2020s. The complex includes both the church and the attached former Dominican convent, though both lost their religious use at the beginning of the 19th century, becoming property of the municipality, and today being part of the city's museum system, with the church housing preserved Renaissance paintings, whilst the convent is home to the Natural History and Archeological Museum. Building works on the church started around 1261, shortly after the municipality of Vicenza decided to have the church built as a grand temple to house one of the thorns from the crown of Christ. The relic had been gifted to the then Bishop Bartholomew of Braganza by King Louis IX of France, and the bishop had hoped to use the relic as a way of bringing religious renewal to the city. He entrusted the management of the church and the convent to the Dominican friars, of which he was, purely coincidentally, a member. Work on the church was completed in less than a decade for its key elements, though, as with any great Christian building, works continued on for centuries afterwards. The prestige of the Dominicans in the city grew in the following centuries, in particular after Pope Boniface VIII assigned them the office of the Inquisition. Absolutely nobody expects the Italian Inquisition in 1303, a role the order held until the office was suppressed under Napoleonic rule in 1797. Throughout the centuries it operated as a church, it became an important religious location for the many wealthy families of Vicenza, with many of the nobility requesting to be buried in the church, the requests accompanied by substantial bequests to the church. Whilst the cloister had been built as part of the original construction works, from 1477 onwards the dormitory and a significantly larger cloister were constructed. This was followed by a refectory and a library. The complex was finally completed when the fourth side of the large cloister was constructed in 1532. In 1481, the noble Valmarana family had a crypt built below the church, in exchange for giving up the chapel they'd previously used, which was converted to house the reliquary. In the second half of the following century, further works were carried out on the crypt, with an extension off to one side constructed based on designs of Andrea Palladio. The convent and church remained functioning through the 18th century, with a community of around 25 religious members celebrating the key feasts of the church, including the Feast of St. Pope Pius V, the Madonna of the Snow, and the Feast of the Holy Fawn. However, that all started to come to an end with the arrival of Napoleon's troops in the city in 1797, with part of the convent building becoming barracks. The Dominicans managed to get control of the convent back briefly between 1801 and 1810, but with the dissolution of the religious orders under a decree from Napoleon, they were forced to leave permanently, the buildings passing to the city. The following year, part of the complex became the seat of a new gymnasium, and in 1877 became a technical industrial institute. The former convent buildings underwent significant modifications between 1872 and 74 to prepare them for educational needs. An Allied air raid on the 14th of May 1944 caused significant damage to the two cloisters, leaving the older cloister significantly damaged. Repairs have never fully been completed on this part of the complex. In 1962, the Technical Institute moved out of the building into a new location, at which point major renovations of the convent were undertaken with a view to converting it into a museum. In 1991, the Museo Naturalistico e Archeologico di Santa Corona opened in the former convent building, housing a collection of exhibits relating to natural history and archaeology from across the city and the region. The first floor of the former convent buildings now houses the natural history collection, which includes numerous fossils, fish and stuffed animals from across the province of Vicenza, along with maps and plans of the geology and geography of the region. One of the key exhibits is an almost 2-metre tall fossilised palm frond dating back around 42 million years. The fossil comes from the Purga di Bolca in Lessinia, an area famous for its rich fossil beds with remains of tropical flora and fauna, including palm trees, turtles, sharks, shells, fish and crocodiles having been discovered there. Also on the first floor is a collection of prehistoric archaeological remains found in the nearby Lago di Fimon, around 9 kilometres south of the museum. Remains include animal skulls and bones, remains of pile dwellings and canoes. There are also Paleolithic and Neolithic tools found in the likely locations of former settlements. The main part of the museum, though, is given over to the Roman city, with the large cloister of the convent being home to a large collection of tombstones, cipi, milestones, stone sarcophagi and other monuments. Many of the artefacts originated in the Roman necropolis, which would have been located on the road leading west out of the city, though there are also artefacts that were recovered following the discovery of a Roman cryptoporticus beneath the cathedral square. Just a few steps from the Santa Corona complex is the Palazzo Leoni Montanari, one of the few grand palaces of the city that wasn't the work of Andrea Palladio. Mostly it was constructed in the second half of the 17th century, long after his death. Today it houses a Vicenza branch of the Gallerie d'Italia museum system with a large collection of Russian icons as well as 18th century Venetian paintings. The Leoni Montanari family commissioned the Grand Baroque Palace as a way to advance their social standing within the Vicenza nobility, being from new money, having built a fortune on the textiles trade. The palace was constructed around buildings the family already owned, with rooms for silk spinning incorporated in the residence. After passing through various hands, the building became the property of the Banca Cattolica Vicentina in 1908. The bank changed its name and ownership on several occasions, including for a while being part of the Banco Ambrosiano, which collapsed in spectacular fashion in 1982 in one of the most serious Italian banking failures of the 20th century, involving the mafia, the Vatican, the Masons, the political system, and God's banker Roberto Calvi, who, after being convicted of financial crimes, was on parole pending appeal when his body was found hanging from scaffolding under Blackfriars Bridge in London with bricks stuffed in his pockets. Initially recorded as suicide, the case has never been resolved. Through various banking restructures, the building passed into the hands of current Italian banking group Intesa Sao Paulo, and the Palazzo is now part of the Gallerie the Italian museum system that covers 4 galleries in Milano, Napoli, Torino and Vicenza. You can wander around most of the rooms in the building, which have been restored to how they would have looked at the time of the building's construction, with the usual over-the-top Baroque decoration with frescoes and stucco on almost every surface. You can also head out into the courtyard of the centre of the Palazzo to take in the shape of the building and some of the modern art installations that are on display in this space. Whilst the Palazzo was built long after his death, a large proportion of the rest of the city's palaces and civic buildings were designed and built by Andrea Palladio. Born Andrea di Pietro della Gondola in 1508 in Padua, into a family of humble origins, he went on to be one of the most influential people in the history of Western architecture, and next time I explore much more of his work, from palazzos and theatres to the symbol of the city, the Basilica Palladiana.